So we have discussed again I'm confused as to exactly when the recording starts because it says starting dung 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 0 and but it starts just before that. I keep reminding you of that because it looks odd when I'm starting. So we have discussed adaptation principles, foundations, incentivizing it, mainstreaming it, and monitoring and evaluation. And we have looked at various examples of implementations and whether any one of them qualifies as a transformational adaptation and so on and so forth. One thing we haven't discussed separately in detail is this idea of who are actually the actors and what are their roles in climate change adaptation. So this is a nice paper that looks at it, a global assessment of actors and their roles in climate change adaptation. As usual, I'll just give a brief summary of the paper, starting with the abstract. An assessment of the global progress in climate change adaptation is urgently needed. Despite a rising awareness that adaptation should involve diverse societal actors and a shared sense of responsibility, little is known about the types of actors, such as state and non-state, and their roles in different types of adaptation responses as well as in different regions. Adaptation is always local, remember, and we have talked about incentivizing or helping people and firms to adapt. And we have talked about the role of the governments, international financing, international coordination, and so on. And yet, systematic analysis is needed as to what exactly their roles are, at what scale in space, right? Local, subnational, national, and so on. Global leadership on adaptation is hard to emerge because adaptation is always local. And unlike mitigation, which has global goal of reducing total CO2 and greenhouse gases and emissions in general, adaptation is much trickier, as we have discussed many times. With all that in mind, based on a large, let me get the pointer up, a large N-structured analysis of case studies, we show that although individuals or households are the most prominent actors implementing adaptation, they are the least involved in institutional responses, particularly in the global south. So adaptations are essentially interventions, and we have always talked about the importance of engaging stakeholders and people in the interventions, co-develop the solutions so that lives and livelihoods are not thrown apart or made unlivable. You displace people in the name of adaptation, then how do you make sure that livelihoods continue, that living standards are not greatly degraded, vulnerabilities are not exacerbated, risks are not increased, and so on and so forth. Keeping all that in mind, individuals and households are the ultimate on-the-street implementers of the adaptation. That those are the ones that get affected, other than, of course, infrastructure, public services, and so on. So then, should they be involved at a much higher level in developing, planning, strategizing, implementing adaptation goals and actions? Of course, yes, but as it stands, they are the least involved in institutional responses which are responsible. So institutions like governments have a responsibility to provide adaptation to protect people, but it still needs to talk to the people before imposing top-down adaptations, especially displacements. Governments are most often involved in planning and civil society in coordinating responses. Adaptation of individuals or households is documented, especially in rural areas, and governments in urban areas. Overall, understanding of institutional, multi-actor, and transformational adaptation is still limited. We looked at this already in the previous podcast, where we took a global stock take of adaptation implementations and looked specifically for adaptations that measure up to these transformational standards, where you're really moving away from business as usual. Here they use something called the depth of adaptation, which we'll look at in a minute. These findings contribute to debates around social contracts for adaptation. that is, an agreement on the distribution of roles and responsibilities, and they inform future adaptation governance. Adaptation is going to be the most critical local scale climate action, and governance of adaptation is critical, as we talked about, making adaptation flexible enough to avoid maladaptations as risks evolve, because you are always adapting to uncertainty. Risks are uncertain. You have something now which may change tomorrow, whether it's heat waves, extreme sea level rise, so chronic and acute stressors that we talked about. So it's a tough job for all, but yet decisions have to be made, because there is no option which comes without risk. If you don't do anything, you're still taking risk. If you do something, you are planning to reduce risk exposure and vulnerability, but you cannot plan for everything. We talked about residual risks, but it's obviously more than that, right? So here are the ways they're analyzed. Actors and their roles in adapting to climate change. Results of the chi-square statistical terminologies. Chi-square test calculating the residuals, that is the difference between the observed and the expected frequency of each combination of actors and adaptation role that are shown here. So just if you know statistics, great, you understand what is being said. If you don't worry about it. We'll just focus on the results and think about what the current conditions are in terms of actors and their roles, and what it means for the future, especially in terms of adaptation governance, as we said. Residuals below -2 and above 2 can be considered as contributing most to the significant result. So statistical significance is to be tested in this chi-square test. Positive residuals in the green indicate a higher observed frequency of an actor-role combination. So actor, let's say household, is supposed to do something like prepare themselves for more floods or heat waves, and they are actually doing that. Okay, so that's the actor role combination. And negative residuals in purple indicate a lower than expected frequency of such a combination being performing well. The size of the circles corresponds to the value of the residuals. So you want the residuals to be in the range where they can at least be measured for statistical significance in terms of observed frequency of actor-role combination being positive or negative. So here is the range of circles: more than 2 with dark green color, less than -4, sorry, more than 4 here in the largest circle with the darkest green, and less than -4 with the darkest purple color with the largest circle. Right? So those are the statistical details, but these are what you want to pay attention to. What are the actor types? Actors and their roles in adapting to climate change. Individuals or households, civil society, so subnational or local, civil society at international, multinational and national levels, governments, again local or subnational and national, international or multinational governance institutions as opposed to coordination institutions or facilitating institutions and financing institutions, and so on. Private sectors can be small, medium-sized enterprises, and private sectors can be corporations. Of course, we have academia, like I am mostly from academia. Even though I work in the field a little bit, I can hardly be called a practitioner. And other. So total number of observations of each role. For good statistician, this is important. Sample size. So we're looking at awareness raising as a role, right? So these are the actors, these are the roles, and you can see that other has a largest dark green here, where actors and roles are in synchrony. Assessing, so the role of assessing is fairly poor. Planning, not bad here at the government level, even to local, but why it's not good at the higher subnational level has to be understood in terms of where the responsibilities, coordinations, financing, planning, strategizing, implementing exists in terms of governance. Financing measures positively, lots of greens going in the positive residual, but you can see in the academia there is a large purple which is probably means that we are not in the business of financing of measures. Anyway, implementing, good role for individuals and households, as we said, and of course academia again not so involved in that, even though concepts of living labs and community engagements with training, research and so on can happen with implementation, but there are governance issues and authorities, you don't have the authority to go implement adaptations. You can advise, provide research on adaptation options and so on. Implementing, unfortunately national governments are got a negative residual here. Coordinating interactions, so civil societies civil society at subnational local levels do well, but not so much in the other. Monitoring, evaluation, here is where academia is playing a good role in looking at actor role combinations in terms of monitoring and evaluation. This study itself is monitoring and evaluation, right? Multi-actor constellations in adaptation. Frequency of actor types reported in green horizontal bars here, as well as how often they were reported as single actor type in a study, single dots, and red vertical bars, or in combination with other actor types, so connected dots. So you have dots, connected dots, and you have horizontal and vertical bars here. And you are looking at combination of cross-actor collaborations to look at frequency of each combination types. Again, details of the analysis here are the meta-analysis, number of publications going into this analysis. Multi-actor constellations in climate change adaptation accumulates, so it's a combination. Individuals and households, how do you interpret it? So you look at the individual role versus collaborating with the other actor types. So you can see that individual households do work with local and private sector corporations, because service providers like foundation, construction, architects, plumbers and so on may be involved, right? Governments here, so I won't go through all the combinations, but you can see the largest combination here happens for number of publications and combinations of cross-actor collaborations. So it's a bit hard to interpret in this way. Yeah, so I'm kind of losing some of the information by not being very detailed in this, but you can follow up on the paper. So the number of studies reporting on individuals or households acting together with civil society, subnational and local and subnational is here. Individuals acting with other, so you have to figure out what others include here. So obviously there will be many players that are not categorized into these actor types. Okay, so gives you a sense of how this works. Looking at the caption of this figure here, regional and urban rural actor patterns in adaptation, relative frequency of actor types reported in publications per settlement type and region. So here are the regions, so Central and South America, Europe, North America, and small island states, with the pie chart showing various fractions where the fractions correspond to these. Relative frequency of actor types as reported in systematic literature mapping, individuals or households, civil society, so just track the colors, subnational, local, civil society, or international, multinational, national. So you have cities having resilient cities programs and so on. So you have combinations that mayors for, there is the global organization of mayors and so on. Governments, local, subnational, national, international, multinational governance institutions, private sectors, small and medium, and corporations, academia and other as before, and number of publications as before. So relative frequency per settlement type, urban ambiguous and rural, so they don't fit in urban and rural. Could be peri-urban interface, or people living somewhere in the mountain or woods, indigenous people, and so on. So you can see the fractions here in terms of relative frequency of actor types, so government and individual households. You can note that individual households obviously carry most of the adaptation load in terms of actual implementation, so that's true for urban, ambiguous, and rural, but urban has larger role for the government in general than elsewhere. And if you look at relative frequency per geography in terms of Africa, Asia, Australia, again individuals count for a lot, but rich countries have larger role for governments, at least at the local and as well as subnational and national, because they have the money and they have the knowledge base and mandate to actually do adaptation planning and implementation, finding the combination of actors and roles that work, right? So looking at other regions, again, households and individuals are the most bigger roles. Europe also has a larger role for governments as a whole. True, of course, for North America as well, but in general, Europe is better. So you can see that these numbers add up to 38-47. Here it adds up to 41. Okay. Similarly, small island states have a larger role for national governments here because they are generally small and you don't have too many local governments, even though you do have a big role for them here. Okay, so patterns in actor role combination across the world. I have a definition of the depth of involvement that I'll read, because last time I wasn't careful. Patterns in actor role combinations across the world, regions, residuals. You can see the negative numbers. So Africa has negative numbers, but number of observations is low. For individuals, this is for government planning. Individuals or households has a larger residual with larger observations and larger percentage of total. Asia has positive residuals for individuals and households for implementing with good number of observations. Europe, again, positive residual with smaller number of observations, and Europe for individuals, and this for government, this is for households. For households, individuals implementing, it has a negative residual, so you have to figure out why that is, right? In general, Europe is much more active in a government level because governments are very proactive and progressive on climate actions that is consistent with this. So similarly, North America for government and so North America here is split into subnational governments, subnational for monitoring and evaluating, subnational for planning, individuals and households for implementing, and others in coordination. So you can see they all have positive except for individuals, and maybe this has to say something here. Individuals is negative and negative because people are expecting the government to do more, or in North America, I mean, it's very different for Europeans and North Americans in terms of how they think about climate change and their own role in adapting. So for example, if you go to coastal communities, they don't want to move away from the water, even if the projections say that cyclones and sea level rise are going to create more and more inundation, storm surge, and damages, and so on. But insurance and underwriters are involved there as well, and now more and more insurance companies are beginning to reject writing premiums where people are exposing themselves to extreme events and floods by trying to settle in regions that are vulnerable. So ultimately the big stick will come from the insurance companies in terms of coverage maybe, and governments have to provide the carrots to move people. So that those numbers play into these individuals and households. Okay, so looking at actors types and response types. So again, without reading the details about the statistics, actor types and actor types are the same that we looked at before, from individuals to academia. And here responses are behavioral or cultural, ecosystem based, institutional, and technological or infrastructural. So these obviously depend on the papers that they can find to analyze, because this is a meta-analysis. But you can see that for individuals and households, the residual is large negative for institutional role, whereas the behavioral and cultural, it plays a good role in terms of positive residual with a fairly large it's more than 2 here, for example. But governments at various levels play a better role, whereas technology is still to register specifically, even though we have looked at renewables for adaptation and so on, and we have looked at transportation, water, agriculture, and so on in terms of adaptation, where technology does play a big role. So remember that this is a meta-analysis that depends on what the studies have reported. So let's read here the depth of adaptation, as we'll see in a minute in the next figure. Overall, there is a limited evidence in the GAMI database, global analysis database here, of more transformational forms of adaptation that include deep systemic shifts. So the system really has to have a regime shift in its practices and not make incremental changes to adapt. That's what we call deep transformational adaptation. I have a separate podcast on the definitions you can look up. All actor types are most often associated with low depth adaptation, that is, responses characterized by a continuation of existing practices or only small changes. So they're incremental adaptations, as we called before. The analysis of how responses of high depth are characterized concerning actor types, roles, response types, regions, and settlement types reveals that they are frequently associated with the case studies in small island states, institutional adaptation, so response types, international governance institutions, so actor, and the coordination of adaptation as the role in this analysis. They are less likely to be associated with the studies reporting on behavioral cultural responses and the role of monitoring and evaluating, which is too bad, because communication and self-reporting by monitoring and evaluation, we discussed a lot, that has to happen, because a lot of the times national adaptation plans may put out something that can be looked at, but unless it is followed by monitoring, evaluation, verification, reporting, then you don't know exactly what happened, because it's very difficult to get the socioeconomic data to do such analysis without reporting. Characteristics of medium to high depth responses in relation to the variables, actor type, role, response types, regions, and settlement types. So small island types, as we said, do better in terms of depth. Behavioral and cultural, not non-existent, because this kind of data is not easily gathered or reported. Institutional, lower than small island states overall. International, multinational governance institutions fall somewhere in the middle in terms of regression coefficients. I'm being a little sloppy here in terms of the statistical analysis, but you can go and read, but just get the relative sense of what we are looking at. Coordinating interaction and monitoring and evaluating, like behavioral and cultural, that is still very low, okay, on in terms of the evidence in the GAMI. Okay, in the global picture, there is limited evidence of transformational adaptation. To put down some concluding thoughts. Further research on actors and implementation gaps in the context of climate change adaptation may shed light on the barriers and potential drivers of transformational adaptation, as different in normative views of adaptation processes as well as outcomes arising from different epistemological and disciplinary entry points. Epistemological is a term that basically about knowledge creation and origin, and disciplinary entry points can lead to different interpretations of adaptation effectiveness. Future research needs to further explore how different actors frame adaptation effectiveness. So when you have indicators and metrics that we talked about a lot, it has to measure something like, let's say, resilience of the adaptation action, resilience accomplished by the adaptation actions, which becomes clear after a long time in terms of how quickly the recovery happens from a perturbation, or how well the system, whether it's infrastructure, public service, individual houses, and so on, withstand chronic and acute climate stressors. Our findings reflect an overall rather incremental implementation of adaptation, where individuals and household adaptation responses are mainly behavioral, low in depth, and with only a limited connection to institutional change, while government actors are in many contexts less prominent, particularly in implementing adaptation. So climate action in general is having a two-step forward, one-step back kind of situation, a dance because of all the perturbations, pandemics, wars, energy supplies, logistics, supply chains. There are always perturbations happening. So governments are not as deep in their role as implementers as one would hope. Such incremental adaptation is important for local communities in dealing with climate risks. It's very difficult to bring about transformational change based on future risk estimates, because people cannot easily be convinced to change lives completely or move away from their roots and so on and so forth. However, our findings suggest a lack of preconditions for more transformational adaptation, which requires systemic change and multi-actor collaboration, building on broad societal support and a shared agreement on roles and responsibilities, a so-called co-production we talked about before for the adaptation interventions. A social contract for climate action and sustainability transformations is imagined here in terms of building on broad societal support and a shared agreement on roles and responsibilities. So it's a social contract that has a long way to evolve. So a bit longer than I expected, but it's a good paper, and this topic is very important, so I'll stop here. Please follow up on the paper and the references that are used for meta-analysis to learn more if you're interested more on this topic. Okay?